I am really excited to be introducing the workshop today. My name is Allie Dericles, and I'm a partner manager here at DBT Labs. And I'll be the host of Driving Actionable Insights, How Analytics Engineers Can Be a Data Consumer's Best Friend Using DBT and Snowflake. Today, we'll be learning about conceptual and logical modeling techniques with two experts. We have Corey Koster, Principal Solutions Architect at phData, as well as Christian Franklin, Principal Solutions Architect at phData. So both Corey and Christian are passionate about helping companies develop data strategies and products that improve the customer employee experience. They're excited to share their best practices with you today. Before we begin, I want to share a couple quick notes on how you can participate in the session. We encourage active participation throughout today's workshop. All of the chat conversation is taking place in DBT Slack in the Coalesce Driving Actionable Insights channel. If you haven't joined the Slack channel yet, now is a great time to do so. And to get the chat started, I welcome you to introduce yourself, let us know where you're calling in from, and who's the data consumer that you have in mind for today's workshop. After the session, Corey and Christian will be available in that channel to answer any questions that we don't get to in the live Q&A today. All right, let's begin. I'll pass it to Corey and Christian.
We do have one additional person here with us today, Dakota Kelly. Didn't want to leave him out. And we did not intentionally dress the same, but. So thanks everybody for attending. As was introduced, right, we're here to talk to you about not just data modeling, but how you can basically incorporate data modeling directly into the development lifecycle. And I think the really important part and the key takeaway for everybody in the audience today is how do you use visual modeling techniques to basically engage your business partners and your stakeholders. But before we get into that, what I wanted to do is just kind of cover off, who phData is and why we actually are even entitled to be up here. So phData is a consultancy. We focus on data engineering, machine learning, as well as analytics. Because of that, we have a lot of experience with data. And with 300 plus practitioners, 1,500 plus projects, we feel like we can bring that knowledge together and help our customers as well as the community. So, as we sort of go through this, I think the premise is that when we're talking about modeling as a discipline, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One is that as we talk about structure and design of data, we can use that as an opportunity to engage our stakeholders. And for us, the way we see it is that analytics and data in general is the combination of people, process, and technology. And the whole notion of being able to raise data literacy within the organization is a really, really critical key success factor to that. So our thesis is that if you can engage your customer, your business partner, in a way that helps them understand how you're thinking about the structure of data and the relationship between the entities, it makes them smarter. And similarly, as their fluency with working with data increases, they start to become more, I'll call it just engaged in terms of talking to you about the problems that they're trying to solve for. So what we want to do today is kind of walk you through a process that we've developed, and we actually implement it at customers. And we see that what ends up happening is the dialogue gets better and better, but also it improves or decreases cycle time. So what we're going to talk about is really what is the problem that we're trying to solve here. And I think oftentimes we get into this, I'll call it a ping pong effect, where I get requirements, I try to engineer them. It's not quite right. And we get this back and forth and back and forth. What we want to do is we want to just compress that and get people engaged in having a conversation around the facts, the dimensions, whatever you want to call it, right? What are the issues that the customer is trying to solve for? What data sources do they need? And then ultimately putting a design together and a structure together that suits their purpose, but also fits into a good practice design pattern so that you have documentation, you have the relationships identified, and you can really start to talk about the data itself. Because in the end, your business partners are usually the domain experts. You're the technical expert. What we're trying to do is basically bridge that. So, not everybody may have experienced this, but I would say that over the years in my career, I've often seen a problem. You go to the next slide. Seen an issue where it's like somebody on the product side says, I want to understand what's happening with my product. What happens there? They go to IT, they request access to the data source, or they have somebody run a report, then they fiddle around with it, and then we just kind of get back and we get into this. What happens then is that somebody says, oh, well, I can do this. They dump it into a G Sheet, they dump it into Excel, and then you have this whole shadow analytics organization spring up. What we're advocating for is stop the madness, right? Talk to your users about what they're trying to do, but also don't be a bottleneck, right? Nobody wants to submit a ticket and then get a response, 2 or 3 sprints out, because by that time the problem's either changed or it's no longer relevant. I think the other part too is that when we talk about people in the business, they're experts in their domain. They understand what they're trying to solve for. And as an analytics engineer and as a data practitioner, you can't do everything. You can't be an expert in all of the different business areas, so you need them as a partner. And I think last but not least, when we talk about data literacy and how do we drive that throughout the organization, this is your opportunity to go find and seek out those individuals that are, I'll call them data curious, right? So you may have somebody that is a junior analyst. This is your opportunity to work with them and make them smarter about data, and let them also be the front end to help interface with the various stakeholders, because oftentimes you can't get that executive's attention for more than half hour. So it's really about how do you find that balance, and then how do you turn those let's call them apprentices, into journeymen, and how can they be your partner in helping you satisfy the needs of the business? So the 3 of us are going to take on slightly different roles today. So I'll be the business guy. Corey, my colleague here, is going to be the product owner, and then Dakota is the analytics engineering rock star. He's going to be driving a big part of the demo. We're going to show you how we have been able to use a modeling tool, and in this case we're using SqlDBM, and incorporating it directly into the life cycle of developing in DBT. We're very Snowflake centric. Admittedly, we're Snowflake's Partner of the Year. So I think that's kind of what we'll be working off of, but this also applies across. Just like you don't have to use SqlDBM to do this, there are plenty of other modeling tools. We just happen to think SqlDBM does a really good job at it. So.
All right. So we know what the problem is. We understand that and why it's a problem. So how do we solve for it? What can we do? This is where DBT, Snowflake, SqlDBM, phData's Toolkit, which we'll cover, that's where this comes in. And what that does is it provides visibility, for one. So we can see where the data is. We can see what the databases are, what the tables are, the columns, and so on. We can see what business logic, excuse me, we can see what business logic is applied along the way, what transformations are being done. It really gives us a full picture of that data lifecycle, of your ecosystem, and understanding point A to point B. Another piece of this is we break down the silos, right? We take down those walls. We enable our users, our consumers, everybody to understand what data is out there, what data is available, what what they don't know. That doesn't mean that we open it up to everybody, right? We still have security, we still have our policies. That's where Snowflake comes in with the role-based access controls. Very nice way to ensure that our data is secure, but we can also democratize it as well. So those things don't have to be separate. We can do both of them. And then the third one here is accuracy. And there's a couple of points to this one. Within DBT, the idempotent implementation, we can ensure that our data is accurate at all times. So if a pipeline needs to be rerun for any reason, our data is going to be accurate. It's only going to change if it truly has changed. So we can have confidence in that setup. Another piece of the accuracy is that we all speak the same language then. So if we are opening this up, we are identifying what the data definitions are, what the metrics are. We open that up to everybody. Everybody is speaking the same thing. So we're all on the same page. And then one more. And then the last one is the phData Toolkit, in particular the data source compare tool. We can look at what the data is in the source, we compare it to what's in the target, what's in Snowflake, and we can ensure that data is being loaded accurately, and we can have confidence in that. So,
So real quick, we've been talking about data modeling, and it occurred to me that it would be good to understand how many people here have a data modeling background or actively participate in creating data models. Okay, great. I was talking with a young gentleman last night, and when I kind of described what we were talking about, he's like, "Oh, you're one of those Kimball guys." I was like, "Oh man." So I had explained to him that there are different methods and patterns for data modeling, but yeah, it was interesting. I felt old.
all right. So what's the impact of this? So we know what our solution is. We have these technologies. What do we gain? Like what is the impact? What's the effect of actually going through this? A couple of points here. So one, we get a more complete picture of that landscape, similar to or related to breaking down those silos. We can understand what data is in the organization, what data is available, how it relates to each other, what it looks like. Maybe there's a new data set that I didn't know existed, or I didn't know it was related to a data set that I use all the time. So it can really spark new conversations, new questions, new ideas, just by that simple fact of opening that up. The second one is we can visually see how it relates. So, SqlDBM, DBT, we get a nice visual picture of what these entities are, of what the objects are, how they relate to each other. And it's a nice visual depiction of what that lineage is from start to finish. And then the last one, keeping your models up to date. We know DBT incorporates software engineering best practices. So we can ensure that our production pipelines are only running the gold standard, the approved code. It's capturing and only using what's in production. And with that, we'll start moving towards the demo, and we'll kind of go through each of the technologies here.
And I think one other thing to add to that is that the point that Corey made about being able to visually represent the data to your stakeholder is huge. I mean, the fact is that most people that I've worked with over my career, you show them a picture, they get it a little bit quicker than if you just show them data. And one of the things that Dakota's going to get into, but the fact that in analytics databases, we sort of kind of throw the idea of constraints out the window is something that we would argue you actually should do that, because even though they're not enforced, it really does help with that visual representation and the relationship of the tables. And that, again, is one of those things that really gets that conversation going. Because in the end, this is about conversation, developing understanding, and then being able to apply that understanding as a technical architecture.
Yes, so some of the tools we use to do this is, first and foremost, our toolkit. We've built a toolkit that allows us to do data diffs between your source system and your data warehouse. So now you can make sure that the data that has come in is exactly the way it looks and should look compared to your source system, and allows us to start streamlining the building of your initial set of transformations of, okay, let's bring in these sources, let's set up the source files, we know all the tables we need, let's bring in everything we can about that so that way we can just start building and not have to sit there and configure our sources. Then, of course, there's DBT. We're going to use DBT to transform. We're going to use this to build our DAG, get to our final model, and use the best software practices. Make sure that we have good pipelines in place. Make sure that everything's automated. We're going through proper Git controls. We have people approving and looking at code, things like that. And then we're using Snowflake, of course, because for us, it's one of the more powerful cloud data warehouses. We're going to use it as our single source of truth. We'll bring all of our different sources in, model them, get the disparate data sets connected, set up, and make our data as explorable and as democratizable as possible. And then SqlDBM. The reason for SqlDBM is it allows us to bring those same sort of automations. I know when I've, in the past, done data modeling, it's fun at first. You sit down, you build a cool model, you get the initial approval, you build that. But then as you start iterating, you forget to go back and update the documentation. And then a year from now, someone comes in, they're like, okay, half the stuff I'm looking for is not here. Well, with SqlDBM, you can do your initial data model, you can build your transformations, you can bring in a package to create your constraints, and then you can sit there and have SqlDBM reverse engineer and rebuild that logical model so your logical model is always up to date with your physical model. And you will always have that documentation correct and easy to share with your business users. So let's go ahead and get to the demo here. So I'll show you over here, and this might be a little hard to see. We have a logical model that's been built. And when we look in our prod database, we have a similar model, but again, we're missing all of our constraints. So the easy way to do this is we will use the DBT constraints package that exists. And this will allow us to go through and apply unit tests that will help us test for our constraints. But then when DBT runs, it will also apply the constraints at the end. And then when we refresh SqlDBM, we will see all the tables interconnected. And if we're using these best practices, providing unit tests, putting our constraints in place as unit tests, we will be able to keep our models up to date. And for those who are looking, we're going to put this code's out there public. We got a link for it. You guys will be able to see it if you go out to the Slack. We're going to post it out there. You guys can grab it. So.
I think the other thing too is that, you know, again, modeling tools, there's quite a few of them out there if you already have standardized on one. But SqlDBM does have trials that you can spin up just like any other SaaS vendor. I think one of the things that plays to its advantage over, you know, the more traditional Irwin type tools is that it is cloud-based, and it gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of engaging with modern data stack. But at the same time, if you have a lot of legacy on-prem stuff, you may find that, you know, Irwin has better coverage for, you know, some of, you know, DB2 mainframe or something like that. Anybody here work with a mainframe? Just asking.
So yeah, he's going through right now, just adding those constraints, doing a merge here.
So, did you have a question?
Yeah, are you enforcing the constraints in DBT and SqlDBM will visualize it? Is that what's happening? Mm-hmm. Can you do the opposite way? Can you make constraints in SqlDBM and then have DBT tests?
Push it to DBT.
I don't know. That would be an interesting. I've never thought about that.
That's an interesting use case. I have not done that, to be honest.
So SqlDBM will let you can build the model and then have it forward engineer. So you'll take your model, it'll then dump all the DDL you would need to create the constraints, all that. But then, of course, when you run your DBT models, most of the time it's going to overwrite that table unless you set it up to be an incremental model. at which point then it will bring in data. But so unless you're going to do all your incremental, you would kind of defeat the purpose of using the forward engineering that way, but that would still be an interesting use case.
Any other questions?
So to answer your other question, yes, that's what we're doing here, is to show, how it can be flowed through to SqlDBM, updated, and reflect the latest and greatest version.
Yeah, and so what we're doing here, you'll see we just merged our pull request. It's going to kick off a DBT Cloud job. We're doing a quick blue-green deployment, so it's going to build everything fresh in a test environment, make sure that everything builds end-to-end, and then swap that into production so that way our production environment has code that executed. What happens is then production gets swapped into test, so if there is something we find, if a BI tool suddenly breaks, we can just quickly swap them back and not have to worry. It makes it easier to reverse back.
How many people here do blue-green deployments? Okay.
What's blue-green deployments?
So essentially what, as Dakota described, right, you essentially have an environment and then you essentially swap environments so that you minimize downtime. It's just a way to get to production faster, is really what it comes down to.
And keep it backup.
Yeah.
Yep. So you can switch back to the old production if you have an issue.
Is it more helpful in batch scenarios, or if you're doing a lot of continuous updates, so you just kind of partition
Yeah.
batch
Yeah.
from
Yeah, I mean, streaming adds a whole nother, like, that's a whole nother thing to factor in, yeah.
like it's Snowflake good at the schema.
Yep. Right.
Yeah, so I'm just watching the pipeline here. We see that our tests have run. We see that the swap's been executed. And then what we're doing after that is just reconfiguring our views. Because, of course, if you create a view and then swap where it's located and it's pointing in a different environment, it's going to be pointing at the wrong data. So what we do is after we run, we just tell the views to be reconfigured to point to prod. That's what we've done here. So that way our views will have the correct data. So that way when we're doing, hourly, half day, every 30-minute refreshes, those are pointing to the correct data, the correct views. So it looks like everything has run now. So let's come on over here and let's reverse engineer. We're going to go to our prod database, which is where we just ran into. We're going to bring in everything but the information schema. Let me save real quick. We're going to upload that reverse engineered. It sees about 45 differences. Let's let it import. And now we have our relationships in place. And then as we're building models, if we keep following the same config, the same standards we're using, applying our unit tests, bringing in new models, making sure the constraints to what data it interconnects with is there, your logical model is now staying up to date with what your physical model is. And when a business user comes to you and goes, hey, I need this, you can now talk from a unified language of, okay, here's how the data connects. How do you need it to connect?
I think another important piece to this, aside from the constraints issue, is that when you're interoperating with your data at this layer, and again, having that conversation with the business stakeholder, you can really get into, how do you want this described? I think one of the things that, we try to really advocate for is managing your metadata, right? Thinking about documentation. How do you put descriptive content around the data itself, which then drives understanding? And so when you're working collaboratively with a team on this, it's a lot easier to sort of get their input on what they think the right, terminology or phraseology is, because again, they're the domain experts, and we don't want, small nuances in definition to sort of create confusion for the data consumers.
Yeah, and this small little step here of just making this visual and providing this diagram to business users, end users, it increases the amount of value add activities they can do. They don't have to spend time reaching out to IT. They don't have to spend time reaching out to a SME, an SME, to understand what data is out there. How does it relate to this? Does it relate to that? This, they can get a link to this or have it in a Confluence site, whatever. You make it available to them. They go look at it. Boom, that answers all of their trivial questions, frees up their time, frees up IT's time, and everybody can just focus on more value add activities.
Something else I want to add is it also kind of allows your business end users to help you troubleshoot. I've been in the room where someone comes in and goes, this is just wrong, but I don't know what's wrong. When you provide this, they know how the data is modeled. You can provide them the DBT documentation and they can see some of that business logic and you can help work together to get to a solution. And you're educating your business user on, okay, here's how the data is modeled and here's how our transformations and here's how we're applying the business logic. And it allows them to come to you and go, hey, this isn't right. This isn't how we do things, or this calculation is not quite correct. Here's a little nuance you missed. And it allows us to make these more apparent to them so that way they can communicate with us and we can provide them better products faster.
Go ahead.
Analyzing the documentation, is there a package or something where our descriptions in DBT can then become in the comments and in Snowflake and save in there so that they reflect in here?
I have built post hooks for that. I've done some stuff like that to try and make these sort of things more documented. I've done post hooks. I don't think there's a package already out there to do that, but maybe I'll take some of the macros I've written and put something out there for y'all.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, right? Because you may be looking at this and you're saying, well, help me understand the difference between this and a data catalog. I would argue they're fundamentally different. This is early on in the life cycle. This will complement a data catalog, but it's not necessarily a replacement for it. What it will do is it will help you really think through what do you need out of a data catalog. But a side benefit is that because this is all version controlled, it kind of fits into that software engineering life cycle, and it's a much more fluid process.
Yeah, so just as a recap, we went through, we made a change to our DBT core. We brought in our unit tests, which performs the unit test, and then we'll, of course, write our constraints. We're able to run our deployment, follow best practices, merge, have an approval, have a deployment run, do a blue-green deployment, and then we can see that our data model is up to date, and no matter how complex, you can keep these things up to date. This is just a simple model of the DBT artifacts themselves if you wanted to track your DBT jobs for visualization and see what's going on. Again, this makes it easy for people to see how things are interconnected and be able to make sense and build those BI tools that answer questions. And another nice little add is that you do get that column level lineage as well with SqlDBM. You can go through and see the logic of all your views and models and see how the columns are changing.
All right, so in summary, I guess, what we walked through is really the end goal is to support our product owners. We support our business users, our data consumers. We complement our analytics engineering and IT, and we really engage the customer. We meet them where they are. We meet them with what they need to answer their questions and enable all facets of the organization.
And I think that's one of the really important shifts, if you will, in this whole, moving from just engineering to this hybrid analytics engineer, is really an attempt to sort of bridge that gap. And really what we're advocating for is that as part of bridging that gap, how do you put tools and pieces and parts in place to support a process that works for you and your customer? Right? Because in the end, I can engineer the hell out of any sort of pipeline and it works really, really well. But if the packaging sucks, I've got an unhappy customer. And so this is really about making sure that you're bringing people into that conversation and talking about what they're looking for in depth and trying to reduce that cycle time. I think the other part of it too is that nobody likes doing documentation, right? So if you can sort of get your customers, if you will, participating in that documentation process, then that's helpful. And then also having a collaborative environment where people can comment on things saying, hey, you know what, this thing doesn't look quite right. You know, can we have a conversation about it? All of that tends to reduce the cycle time. I will say no tool is a silver bullet, right? There's people involved and there's a process involved, and you need to think about how does this potentially fit into your organization. Our learnings have been that when we introduce this concept and we really start talking about modeling as a discipline, it does make a difference in how we get to sort of the end result that is mutually satisfactory for all parties involved. And then being able to sort of use that to promote data literacy throughout the organization is a really important part. Since we are between you and lunch.
Yeah. Any questions? We'll keep it short, like Christian mentioned, and we know we're bumping up against lunch, and we don't want to keep people. So.
Maybe a little bit about phData Toolkit is essentially what it embodies or encompasses is the experiences that we've gleaned from a lot of these engagements. And when we see patterns, we actually have a product engineering organization that helps build out things so that they're usable and they're not just a bunch of one-offs. We make these available to our customers. They're not licensed products. And what we're really trying to solve for are some of the edge cases or the niche cases that may not be addressed. So whether it's automation, Dakota had mentioned the toolkit and the data validation piece of it. We find that our ability to sort of bring that together and then work it into the DBT lifecycle is very productive, particularly when you're looking at migrating code, because it gives you not only a visual representation of where you've got diffs and then potentially the severity of it. The other thing that we see a lot of is people struggle with SQL translation. Our background is a Cloudera, Hadoop background, and so a lot of times Hive to Snowflake is it's a bit of a rough one, right? And so when you've got a lot of code to convert, being able to automate that and not just do a regex type automation, but actually do the type of translation tends to be it's an accelerator. So.
All right. Thank you for a wonderful workshop, Corey, Christian, and Dakota. That was exceptional. If you'd like to continue with the Q&A online, please head back over to the Slack channel. Again, it's Coalesce Driving Actionable Insights. And the speakers will be on the Slack channel for a little bit after the session to answer any additional questions there. So thank you all again for being here.
And I'm going to go change my shirt.